Hello everyone out there. Thank you for joining us on today's episode of Creating the World We Want. Our mission is to have an hour-long discussion discussing how we can enhance our civic systems by really diving into the underlying issues that the media tends to overlook. My name is Tom Dodge, and I'm here with my co-host Bob Massey and our extraordinary guest, Francess Lappé. And Bob, you want to introduce her?
Well, this is so exciting for me because Francess Lappé, Frankie, has been a hero of mine for many, many, many years. And just in the last couple of years, we've become very good friends and found projects that we're going to talk about later to work on together. It's impossible, really, to summarize this amazing woman's life. But she was born in Oregon. She grew up in Texas, which I'm hoping you'll talk to us a little bit about. She went to Earlham College. And then in the 1970s, she did something that changed America. She wrote a book called The Diet for a Small Planet. This is my copy that I have had for 40 plus years. And it very boldly laid out a new vision for the whole idea of food and hunger and cooking. And it took America by storm and sold how many millions of copies? 3 million copies. And you were still a young woman, and this exploded into the American consciousness. And we're going to talk about that. But it's not as though Frankie wrote this book and then that was the last we heard from her. She went on to found multiple important organizations, to write another 18 books, to move more and more heavily into a diagnosis and action about our broken democracy, and many, many other things. So one of the things that I really admire, people who commit to a pathway of fighting for social justice and fighting for equality, and then maintain that commitment. And I think Frankie is famous around the world for having done that. She won the Right Livelihood Award, which is often called the Alternative Nobel, which is also something Bill McKibben won, another dear friend of ours. So we're going to have a great conversation. Frankie, thank you so much for everything you've done and for the chance to hear your thoughts for folks who also want to create the world we want, which, by the way, was the subtitle of one of her books. So she and I, even before we knew each other, came up with very similar ideas about how to focus our work. So again, Frankie, thank you. And I'd like to start just jumping right into this interesting childhood. So
yeah, very interesting.
So tell us about it. We have some time, and we'd love to hear about how you became you and what the interesting stories, some of which I've heard about your childhood, helped shape you.
Well, I lived in two worlds very much. I grew up in Fort Worth, Texas, during the late 40s, 50s, and early 60s, and it was a very racist, very misogynistic, very narrow thinking culture. And so that was that was the community I was in. But then my parents, my dad was a weatherman for the U.S. government. My parents were very courageous visionaries, totally uncelebrated and pure. And they founded a Unitarian church in Fort Worth, Texas during this terrible period of McCarthyism, and they integrated it while the city was still segregated. And so much, that they were stopped by the police and taken into the police station once just for having a black couple in the back seat. That was the culture I grew up in. And it was completely segregated, all white working class neighborhood that I lived in. So I lived in these two worlds, and my heart world was in the church where I was part of the youth group, and we went to summer camp, all of our vacations were church camps, a Unitarian church camp. So those values, I still remember the church that they finally got an actual building, and we called it the Wayside Pulpit. I don't know if that's a common name, but I remember among the Unitarian principles, I remember the word democracy in human relationships. And so I often think, well, maybe that imprinted upon me, but so my childhood was very, very formed by my parents' values. And my mother's closest friends were African American, and so that, I think, is the most formative thing I can tell you about myself, is I grew up in that. I can update it though to current into the 2018 midterms. I said, okay, I'm going to go back to Texas and work for Beto O'Rourke. why not? And so I got there and said, can I go back to my old neighborhood? And they said, no, 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 it's too dangerous. It's all Hispanic and black now. And I said, I'm going. And this was the white working class neighborhood that I felt pretty alienated from. I went back door to door. For the first time, I felt at home and safe and welcomed by the Hispanics and blacks that came to the door. And so much so that I put on my high school graduation ring to celebrate my reconnection with my real roots. So people who shared my values. So
That's amazing, full circle.
yeah, full circle.
Well, I just want to add super quickly that your partner, Richard Rowe, had a very interesting experience in Iowa. Maybe you could tell that very quickly.
Yeah, well, we went back in '04, yeah, we were campaigning then, and he grew up in this very small town in Clarinda, Iowa, and so we were sent back there to campaign. He was working for Howard Dean, and the first door we went to, they recognized it was unbelievable. He just said he hadn't been there in 60 years.
Yeah.
And the
his
gentleman
father
who
was a pastor?
His father was a pastor.
Uh-huh.
And my partner Richard Rowe opened the door, and the gentleman, elderly gentleman of course, looked at him and he said, Charles Ronald Rowe. That was his dad, my partner's dad's name. And so it was just this incredibly beautiful moment of going back to the
being
roots.
welcomed in the
being
very
welcomed
house.
in the very, and got to go back and he got to ring the bells in the church that he grew up in.
Life works in very interesting ways.
It does, it does.
Another part of your youth you just mentioned to me was the island life, and how that developed your kind of global perspective on the world. Would you mind diving into that and the lessons you learned?
That was the most extraordinary experience, because I think they never said this to us, but I think that they chose to leave 1953 to 55 were the years that we were on this tiny island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, Wake Island, which is very important in World War II, and it's an whole other story. But now that I look back on it, they said that, we want to go there because we'll save a lot of money, it's a hardship post, and they'll pay my dad more to be a weatherman for the government. All that was true. They wanted to burn the mortgage, so to speak, which they were able to do, but really I think they were escaping the McCarthy era in part too, and all of the stress, because people actually lost their jobs just by virtue of being a member of my parents' church. So we left for this tiny island on which I remained for 2 years. It is 2.5 square miles. So the ocean was my playground. But I think one of the most formative aspects was that there were probably a dozen nationalities represented, and my parents were the kind of people who brought others into our home. So we had Filipinos and Japanese and Hawaiians and Koreans, and my best friend was a Japanese-Korean mix. And I think it just made me absolutely an internationalist. And also, there were no rules. There was one stop sign on the island, and that said, stop, watch for planes, because the road and the runway crossed. But it taught me a certain amount of independence, because we could go any place, anytime.
And how old were you at this time?
9 to 11. So it was that perfect age before adolescence. Although I did have a crush on a Samoan in my class, I have to say. I heard that he was going to be a prince someday in Samoa. But still, before adolescence really hit. And so it was a perfect experience, and I became more independent and saw all these delicious, because I was the one who wanted to eat all the different cuisines of all these different cultures. Everybody else in my family was a little skittish, but I just was so attracted to all the different delicacies from the different cultures, and hung out with the Filipinos at their fish fries, and so it was extremely formative experience. Yes.
So let's move forward right into this amazing experience with Diet for a Small Planet. So maybe you could draw a line for us as to how these formative experiences brought you ever more into being concerned about justice and specifically food, and then how you decided that what the world needed was this combination of clear political analysis and recipes and a whole different vision that burst out through this book. How did that come about? It wasn't something that people were, demanding. It was something that you...
Well, it was in the air, though, but let me just jump back.
Yeah, okay.
Because I mentioned the word internationalism. So my first goal in life was actually to be a diplomat and save the world through the U.S. State Department. So I went to American University School of International Service, and within 6 weeks, I realized, maybe this is not the way to save the world.
Maybe not through the State Department.
Not through the State Department.
Right.
So I called a friend from my Unitarian roots, and she was at Earlham College, a Quaker school. And I thought, oh, maybe that'll be the opposite of what I'm experiencing here. So I went to Earlham and majored in history. But when I left Earlham was right at the height of the war on poverty and the whole vision of the Great Society. And so it was just a very natural thing from these Quaker roots and my Unitarian roots to want to participate in the war on poverty. And we actually did, as my friends brought a program to Earlham by organizing, that's a longer story, but anyway, after I left Earlham, I went to Philadelphia. And believe it or not, in that era, the war on poverty included the office of the HUD, the Housing and Urban Development. I was in Philadelphia at the time, and the HUD of Philadelphia was actually hiring people to be community organizers in the war on poverty. And my job assignment, even though my official title was housing inspector, but that was kind of a ruse. I say now that I was a covert agent in the war on poverty, because my real job is to go door to door for the Welfare Rights Organization. So can you believe it? I was paid by the city via funds from the federal government, the war on poverty, but my real job, and the reason that I was paid to do that was because it's a very enlightened understanding that the city was trying to enable people who were victims of slumlords and renters in this African American community, to enable them to buy their homes. And they understood that to be able to do that, you need to feel confident and hopeful, and that comes through connection with others. And so
Agency,
meaning and connection. And so my job was to go door to door. This little white girl, I was 23, all African American, but they were so welcoming. And so we formed the first Northwest Philadelphia Welfare Rights Organization. And so my job, that was my first job. And so from that, then my wonderful husband, now deceased, was offered a postdoc in Berkeley. And so I went to Berkeley, and I was part of the social work school where he was doing his postdoc in cancer research. But very soon I felt like I really had to stop doing anything until I understood why. I was just so determined, like, wait, is this really the root? Am I getting to the roots of the suffering that was so evident? And so I decided I had to stop doing anything and just ask why? And that then, I say that the food question, why are people hungry, it was sort of in the air. A book called The Population Bomb had just exploded. Oh, we don't have enough food, we're running overrunning the Earth's capacities. And a book called Famine 1975 was published, which was terrifying everyone. And so I had maybe my best intuition in life, which is if I could just understand why hunger in the world, that would unlock the mysteries of economics and politics. Because every species, yes, they feed themselves, feed their offspring, and we were failing. There were so many hungry people. And so I thought, oh, I'll start with that. If we can't eat, what else matters? Right? It's so basic. And so I just kind of bored in at the UC Berkeley Agricultural Library, and that was before Googling. So I had to go to the library and over again, and she took me from one stack to another stack, and soon in that process I realized, wait a minute, these experts started falling off their pedestals because I realized there was more than enough food for everyone in the world, and that's more true today than then. So it was just that big shock, and I've got to tell people. So I started out with a one-page handout I was going to tack around Berkeley and saying, oh, we can't blame nature. Hunger is caused by our systems that we create. Isn't that liberating? We can end it because it's not a natural phenomenon, it's unnatural, and we can change it. So then I said, well, maybe you should know a little bit more. and it became a little booklet. And then it got into the hands of the founder of paperback publishing in America, Betty Ballantyne. And so the rest is history. Betty just died this last year at the age of 99. Mm-hmm. And I got to tell her that, of course, she changed my life forever. And I got to ask her, why did you take a chance on this kid? I was then 26, who had never published so much as a letter to the editor. And her response, Frankie, it was your ideas. If you couldn't write it, I could do that. So that was publishing then.
Well, let's talk about this a little bit, because I remember, maybe I have this wrong, but I remember that when this book came, that you telling me that some of the reaction from the sort of professional policy people and men in the field was, how can you deal with a big global issue by writing a cookbook? And that sometimes people dismissed you.
President of Tufts. Yeah.
Well, so let's talk about that for a second, because this is a period when sexism was dominant, and here you are, this dynamic but uncredentialed female proposing to change the world without hundreds of academic studies, and instead giving people.
It's very well put in.
Oh no! I mean, one thing I've learned about Frankie Lappé is that she wants every single thing. Here, you can see she wants every single thing documented. But I'm talking about the bias that met this. Could you just talk about that a little bit? Did you run into, was that a...
And like why there was bias? Why is there a backlash to change, you know?
Yeah, I honestly, at the time, yes, there were a few comments, but I was just amazed, totally amazed at the positive response, because honestly, I thought, Berkeley was this little separate nation kind of feeling, and maybe 500 people in Berkeley would buy the book. My dad was the one who believed in it. But my dad and Betty Ballantyne, and I really, I made a D on my first English paper in college. So, I wasn't exactly setting out to be a writer. And so I was just so relieved. I still remember sitting on my couch with my mom and crying and said, what if I got a decimal point wrong? And the whole thing is, wrong. Because I didn't have any, I did all these calculations with my dad's slide rule. But fundamentally, nobody could argue with any of the data analysis. It was the data and the analysis. So I didn't, my big relief was one, one, that there were no huge mistakes, and it was fundamental, and two, that people were buying it. And and the recipes, by the way, were Betty Ballantyne's idea. I was into the ideas, and she said, well, to get these ideas out, let's have recipes. So my partner, my husband at the time, was at UC Berkeley in the labs there, so he brought me home a gram scale. And then the scientists were telling us we needed to balance out the proteins to get the highest usability of the protein. So I would measure the balanced proteins with my gram scales. I felt like the chemist in the kitchen. I felt great. So I didn't have a feeling. I was just delighted that anybody was interested, and it was very little reviewed, however, except by the Boston Globe. And Adam Eichen, my friend, was telling me not too long ago that he loved it because the title was Recipe for Revolution. I think, yes, that's it, they got it. Because very soon after the book came out, I was summarizing it in one or two sentences, however you want to do it, that hunger is not caused by a scarcity of food, it is caused by a scarcity of democracy. And so it was a very radical message, and anybody who really read it understood that. It wasn't just about getting gram scales in the kitchen and balancing your protein.
So since you wrote this book, how have you tried to spread that spirit of democracy, like through your work?
Well, I co-founded the organization Food First and wrote the book Food First. That was my second book, co-authored with Joe Collins. And there we tried very, very much, in every book I've written, democracy as a theme, but we got to it through through 50 questions about hunger. And I decided that by the early 90s that I really, really wanted to focus on this bigger challenge of redefining democracy as including multiple arenas of our lives, that it shows up in many dimensions, in education, in social services, and in the economy, most certainly, not just at the polls. So I co-founded the Center for Living Democracy in the early 90s.
Can you define living democracy to our audience in your terms?
Well, just one way of saying it is democracy as a culture, not just a structure of government, number one. And by culture, I mean a culture in which I've come to define as a culture in which power is fluid and dispersed, widely dispersed and continually evolving in that distribution, in which public affairs are transparent so that we can see what's going on, and in which there is a cultural norm that I've come to call mutual accountability. If we're all connected, we're all implicated, or as Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel has said, some are guilty, we're all responsible. So that theme of we can't just be blamers, which is one of the most tragic developments of our current failures, is that we are encouraging people to say, oh, I'm innocent, you're guilty, you're at fault, rather than how did we together create the situation and together correct it. So that it's a norm, it's an ethic of mutual accountability. So dispersion of power, accountable power, i.e., and transparency and mutual accountability are the three dimensions. But then the question, how do they play out in education? What does that look like in the classroom? What does that look like in social services? That it's not just the doctor prescription, but it's the participation and self-help groups joining together. We know how much healing goes on, and patients taking responsibility also for our health. And so those ethics of mutual accountability and transparency and just accountable dispersed power, I think they apply in all these arenas, and that's what this book, Democracy's Edge, is about, because I look at each, I look at corporate accountability and democratic economy. I look at what does a school look like that is a democratic school.